Don't be scared of me, said the 7-foot Apache woman, crying. But the cowboy didn't fear instead. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The sun sank low behind Bitter Mesa, flattening the light across the land until the dry grass looked washed out and the shadows stretched long and thin. A cold breeze pushed against Walker Hale's shirt as he rode the final stretch toward his cabin. He felt the familiar ache in his shoulders from a long day in town, picking up nails, feed, and a few supplies he couldn't make himself. His life ran on simple structure: keep the ranch running, keep his head clear, avoid trouble. The routine helped him keep distance from the memory of his younger brother, who had died during a border conflict years earlier. Walker still carried guilt for not being there when it counted, and he'd built his days around the idea that silence and steady work kept him from thinking too much. He didn't expect anything unusual when he turned off the trail. His horse seemed relaxed until its ears snapped forward. Walker straightened in the saddle, scanning the yard. His breath tightened when he saw a figure near the corral. Too tall to be anyone he knew, too still to be wandering livestock, too deliberate to be a lost traveler. He slowed the horse, keeping his posture calm even as uncertainty rose in his chest. The figure stepped out from the side of the barn, revealing a woman who towered over the fence post. She had to be close to 7 feet tall. Her long black hair hung in uneven strands, dust clinging to the ends. Her deerskin clothing was torn at the seams, the fabric stretched and worn from hard travel. She raised both hands slowly, her fingers spread, signaling she carried no weapon. Her voice came out strained, almost hoarse. "Don't be scared of me." Walker didn't reach for his gun. He stayed alert, but what struck him more than her height was the way her legs wobbled slightly as she braced herself. She looked dehydrated. Her jaw was clenched in a way that said she had been walking far past her limit. He didn't sense aggression, only exhaustion layered over fear. He stepped down from the saddle, boots pressing into the dirt with a steady weight. "What happened to you?" he asked quietly. The woman swallowed, her throat visibly tight. "My name is Naira. I was forced out from my band after refusing to be claimed by a man I did not choose." She glanced toward the distant road, as if expecting riders to appear. "I kept moving. I didn't know where else to go." Walker took in the details: small cuts along her arms, a bruise forming near her collarbone, dust caked into the folds of her moccasins. She had traveled without real rest. Whatever fear she carried ran deeper than the moment. He knew enough about being cast out. His own years of self-imposed isolation often felt like a punishment he never finished serving. "You walk a long way," Walker said. His tone wasn't soft, but it wasn't cold either. "You hungry?" Her eyes shifted, unsure if the offer was real. "I don't want trouble. Just a place to breathe for one night." Walker felt a heaviness settle in him, the kind that came when he recognized someone standing on the edge of breaking. He didn't trust easily, but he wasn't about to leave someone half collapsed in his yard. He stepped aside from the cabin door. "You can come inside," he said. Naira hesitated. Her height alone made her seem imposing, yet her expression carried something fragile under the surface: stress, fear of being turned away, and a kind of shame that didn't belong to someone who had done nothing wrong. After a brief moment, she followed him toward the porch, her steps uneven but determined. Inside, the cabin held the warmth of a recently stoked stove. Walker hung his hat on a hook by habit before pouring a cup of water from a clay jug. He placed it on the table and stepped away so she wouldn't feel cornered. Naira approached the cup slowly, as though it might disappear if she reached too fast. Her hands shook slightly as she lifted it. She took measured sips, pacing herself with the discipline of someone who had learned the hard way not to overdrink after going without. Walker watched her reactions more than her appearance. Her eyes darted to the door from time to time, her muscles tightening every time wind pushed against the walls. Her instincts were sharp, shaped by months of being hunted or unwelcome. He recognized signs of someone who didn't expect safety in any place. "You hurt anywhere?" he asked. "No," she said, though her breathing remained shallow. Only worn down. I kept moving because stopping felt dangerous. He nodded, understanding more than he let on. After his brother's death, he had spent years drifting through ranch jobs, never staying long anywhere, because standing still made his mind circle back to things he didn't want to face. Eventually, he'd bought this small ranch to force himself into a routine. It wasn't happiness, but it kept him steady. "You can rest here," Walker said. "Nobody will bother you." Naira set the cup down carefully, as if worried she might break it. "You don't even know me." "I know you're tired," he replied, "and you're not causing trouble." She sat on the bench with slow control, adjusting herself so she took up less space. Her breathing lengthened, her shoulders easing one small inch at a time. Walker placed an extra blanket near the far wall. He didn't tell her where to sleep. He let her decide her place in the room. The stove crackled with low heat. Naira studied the cabin, the tools hanging neatly, the single bed pushed against the wall, the quiet simplicity of a man who lived alone by choice and necessity. She seemed to weigh the reality of the space with the same seriousness she gave to approaching unknown land. Walker noticed the way her hands finally stilled in her lap. For the first time since stepping out of the shadows, she looked like she might let her guard down. "Just a little." "Thank you," she said. Her voice was quiet but steady. Walker gave a small nod. No more words were needed. Outside, the last traces of sunlight faded from the ridge. Inside, the silence became something that didn't feel empty anymore, something that held two people who had arrived at this moment for different reasons but shared the same instinct: to survive another day without collapsing. For the first time in a long while, Walker sensed that the night would not feel as heavy as it usually did. And Naira, though still tense, seemed to recognize that this place, at least for now, wasn't another threat she had to run from. The cabin settled into silence after nightfall, broken only by the soft crackling of the stove and the wind brushing against the outer walls. Walker sat on the edge of his bed, pulling off his boots with slow movements. He could feel Naira's presence across the room, even without looking. Her breathing was heavier than before, steady but laced with the kind of exhaustion that ran deep into the bones. She had chosen to sleep on the bench rather than the floor. She lay curled slightly, knees drawn in, as though staying small made her feel less exposed. Walker watched her for a moment, not out of curiosity, but out of concern. The bruising near her jaw looked darker under lamplight, and her shoulders twitched occasionally, signs of a person whose sleep came cautiously. He turned down the lantern flame until it dimmed to a soft glow. When he finally lay down, the unfamiliar reality of another person sharing the space made him more alert than usual. He breathed slowly until the tension eased from his chest. Naira shifted in the night. At one point, Walker heard her sit up sharply, as if jolted by a sound he hadn't noticed. Her breathing quickened, then slowed back to a controlled rhythm. She didn't speak, and neither did he. They allowed the silence to settle again, each coping with their own memories. Walker kept still, understanding that whatever haunted her would take time to fade. By dawn, faint light crept through the window, spreading across the wooden floor in a thin band. Walker rose quietly, pulling on his coat to check the yard. When he opened the door, cool morning air hit his face, and he scanned the property out of habit. Fence intact, corral empty, no tracks from unwanted visitors. He returned inside to find Naira already awake. She sat where she had slept, hands folded on her lap, her eyes tracking every movement he made. "You didn't rest much," Walker said. "Rest comes slow," she answered, her voice low but clearer than the night before. Her gaze drifted to the stove. Walker understood the hint, placing a small pot of water to heat. He laid out a bit of bread and dried meat on the table. Naira approached with hesitant steps, stopping twice as though unsure if she was allowed to stand so close. When he motioned to the bench, she lowered herself carefully. She ate with disciplined control, taking small, measured bites. Walker noticed the way she straightened her posture when she chewed, a habit likely formed from living in places where appearing weak invited danger. When she finished, she pushed the plate forward slightly, signaling she wouldn't take more than necessary. "You can eat more if you want," Walker said. Her eyes flickered with conflict, gratitude matched with caution. This is enough. Walker accepted her decision without pressing further. He stepped outside to feed the horse, and Naira followed him out, remaining a few paces behind. The morning air carried the smell of dry earth and distant sage. She took in the landscape with sharp, sweeping glances, noting every ridge, every dip in the land, every place someone might hide or approach from. Walker opened the barn door, and the horse lifted its head, snorting softly. Naira stiffened at the sound, her body tensing in a reflex that suggested past encounters with startled animals or hostile men. Walker spoke calmly to the horse, letting Naira observe how he handled it. His tone stayed even, and the horse settled almost immediately. "You don't have to come this close if you don't want," he said, noticing her rigid stance. Naira shook her head once. "I need to understand your land. I need to know where trouble could come from." "Trouble doesn't come often," Walker replied. "Trouble doesn't warn you before it comes," she said quietly. Her words made Walker pause. He could see she wasn't speaking generally. She was describing her own life. As they walked back toward the cabin, Naira studied the porch, the windows, the roof, assessing structural details with silent calculation. She wasn't judging the place. She was learning it, understanding its safety, choosing how much trust she could afford. Inside, she stood near the wall again, but this time she didn't fold herself inward. She let her posture rise to its full height, no longer shrinking. Walker took note of the shift. She was beginning to accept that he didn't fear her, and that realization seemed to loosen a fraction of the tension in her shoulders. "What's your plan now?" Walker asked, not pushing her, but giving her room to speak. Naira looked at the ground first, then lifted her eyes slowly. "I don't know yet. I need my strength back before I decide anything." Her voice carried a steadiness that hadn't been there the night before. "But I won't stay longer than you want." Walker leaned a hand against the table. "You're not causing me any trouble." A long breath escaped her, as though she had held it since the moment she arrived. She looked toward the window, watching the rising sun touch the ridge. Something in her expression shifted. Not hope exactly, but a kind of relief that she no longer had to face the morning completely alone. Walker poured her another cup of water, sliding it across the table with a simple motion. Naira reached for it, without hesitation this time. The room felt different than it had the previous night, still quiet, still cautious, but no longer edged with fear. It held the early shape of trust, thin yet present, forming in the space between two people who had not expected to depend on anyone ever again. The day was just beginning, and though neither said it, both understood that whatever came next would force them to face challenges neither had planned for. But for now, they shared a room, a table, and the first steps towards something steadier than survival. The day grew warmer as the sun lifted above the ridge, turning the dry yard into a pale stretch of dust and sparse weeds. Walker stepped outside, carrying a handful of nails, intending to repair a loose board on the porch railing. The wood had split during a storm the week before, and he wanted it fixed before the next wind rolled in. As he set the board into place, he heard the cabin door creak softly. Naira stepped outside, blinking against the bright light. She had washed her face with the water he set out earlier, and the fresh layer of dust on her cheeks showed she had been awake long enough to study the yard again. Her posture remained tall, but there was a noticeable heaviness around her eyes, a weight that came from thinking too much in too short time. She stood a few feet away, hands clasped loosely as if preparing herself for something uncomfortable. Walker continued working, but he waited for her to speak. She approached with slow, deliberate steps, stopping near the porch where she could lean against a beam if her legs grew unsteady. "You were kind last night," she said quietly. Her tone was steady, yet her fingers curled slightly against her palm as though bracing for his reaction. "I did not think anyone would take me in." Walker tightened the nail, glancing at her without turning fully. "You needed help." Naira shifted her weight, her jaw tightening as if pushing against a memory. "People don't help women like me. Not when trouble follows us." He didn't press, but his silence left enough room for her to continue if she chose. She exhaled slowly, grounding herself. My band ordered me to belong to a man who held too much power. I refused. He and his brothers decided I had no place among them anymore. She paused, her throat tightening. They said a woman who stands against a leader stands against the tribe. Walker stopped hammering. The calm in his hands faded slightly as he looked at her fully now. Her expression was controlled, but the tension in her neck showed how much she was holding back. "How long have you been on your own?" he asked. "2 months," she answered. "I hid in dry ravines, old sheep pens, anywhere that kept me unseen. When I reached the border hills, I kept walking because I didn't know what else to do." Her voice didn't tremble, but her breaths were short. She had grown used to telling her story without emotion, because emotion had been dangerous for her. Walker leaned the hammer against the porch rail. "You shouldn't have had to walk that far alone." Naira's gaze moved to the corral, her eyes following the lines of the fence, then the barn roof, then the trail she had arrived from. "Every place I passed, I expected to be chased away. I thought men would see me and use my size as an excuse to treat me as something less than human." She paused, pressing her thumb against the bone of her wrist. "When you didn't reach for your gun, I didn't understand why." Walker returned to the railing. "Not everyone's looking for a fight." She watched him work again, studying the slow, deliberate motion of his hands. The steadiness seemed to ease something in her. She lowered herself to sit on the porch step, the wood creaking slightly beneath her weight. After a long moment, she asked, "Why do you live out here alone?" Walker didn't answer immediately. The question cut close to the truth he rarely said aloud. He wiped dust from his palm and leaned against the post. "My brother died during a border skirmish. I blame myself for not being there. After that, I didn't feel like I belonged anywhere with people around." His voice dropped lower. "I came here for quiet. I needed a place where no one expected anything from me." Naira studied him carefully. She didn't offer sympathy. Her eyes instead showed understanding, the kind born from carrying her own set of wounds. "The land doesn't ask questions," she said. "No," Walker replied, "but it doesn't answer any either." She took in the yard again, this time with a different expression. Less fearful, more thoughtful. "You fix this place by yourself. For the most part. It keeps me busy." Naira let her fingertips rest against the wooden step. "I used to help repair shelters in my village." She hesitated, then added, "It gave me purpose. I lost that when I left." Walker glanced at her hands, large, steady, rough at the knuckles, then back at her face. "You can help here if you want." Her eyes widened just slightly, not with surprise, but with something close to relief. Not a dramatic sort, but the quiet acknowledgement that maybe she wouldn't spend the next day wandering again. "I can do that," she said softly. For a long moment, the porch stayed silent except for the distant rattle of wind moving through the dry grass. Naira seemed to settle into the step as though testing whether she truly had permission to stay. Her breathing deepened, and the rigidity in her shoulders eased a fraction. Walker returned to the broken board with renewed focus, but now every movement felt different. He wasn't just repairing a railing. He was building the first fragile sense of stability for someone who had been running far too long. And Naira watched him work with the steady patience of a person who was slowly letting herself believe she would not be cast out again. Late morning heat pressed down lightly on the yard as Walker carried a toolbox toward the broken section of the corral. The fencing had loosened after months of wear, and he'd been putting off repairs until he felt certain Naira was steady enough to move around without collapsing. Today, she looked stronger. Her steps were firmer, and her eyes carried less of the frantic scanning he'd noticed on the first night. She followed him without being asked, her height casting a long shadow across the dirt. She stopped beside the fence post and examined the split wood. Her fingers brushed lightly over the grooves, assessing the damage the same way someone trained in survival might evaluate a shelter before resting inside it. Walker set the toolbox down. "Posts are cracked. Need tightening." Naira nodded once, not speaking yet. She crouched, testing the ground where the post sat. She shifted it gently, confirming that one side had loosened from erosion. Walker watched her movements. Despite her size, she handled the materials with careful precision. adjusting her strength so she didn't make the damage worse. He handed her a length of rope. "We'll brace it first." She wrapped the rope around the post with practiced hands, looping it in firm, even circles. Walker pulled from the other side, tightening the tension until the wood stopped wobbling. When she stood, dust rolled down her legs, and she wiped her palms on her skirt with a calm, methodical rhythm. "Where did you learn repairs like that?" Walker asked. "My uncle taught me," she said. "We fix storage shelters every season." Wind tore the roofs apart by spring. Her voice held a hint of memory, but no smile. Her past still seemed to rest on the edge of pain. Walker nodded, acknowledging the skill without pushing for more details. They worked together in silence. Walker hammered a new plank while Naira steadied the post with both hands, her grip unwavering. When he reached for another nail, she passed it to him before he asked. Their movements began forming a pattern, him working the tools, her adjusting the materials, each supporting the other's task without discussion. At one point, Walker caught her glancing at the ridge again. Her gaze lingered on the distant hills, checking for movement. Even while helping, her instinct stayed sharp. "You expecting someone to come after you?" Walker asked. "Not today," she answered. "But I've learned not to assume calm means safety." He didn't argue. He knew people who carried scars that kept their senses sharp long after the danger passed. When the fence was finally secure, Naira stepped back, studying their work. Her shoulders lifted and lowered in a slow breath, something like satisfaction settling into her chest. She pushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear, her hands finally still. "It's stronger now," she said simply. Walker wiped his forehead with the back of his wrist. "Couldn't have done it this quick without you." A small shift occurred in her expression. Not a smile, but a softening, like someone hearing appreciation for the first time in months. Inside the barn, Walker checked the grain sacks while Naira stood near the stalls. The horse snorted and shuffled its hooves. She watched the animal closely, her body tensing at the sound of sudden movement. Walker picked up on her discomfort. "He's calm," Walker said. "Won't bother you." Naira stepped closer, hesitating before reaching out. She let the horse sniff her hand before making contact. The animal nudged her palm gently. She kept her breathing controlled, steadying her nerves. "He trusts easy," she said. "He knows when someone means no harm," Walker replied. Her shoulders lowered a little more. When they stepped back into the sunlight, the air felt different. Not lighter, but fuller somehow, as if the yard now held evidence that two lives had started working side by side instead of just passing through it separately. Naira paused near the porch, taking in the land again. The lines of her posture showed something new. She wasn't just memorizing escape routes anymore. She was beginning to study the place, as if she might be here tomorrow, and maybe the day after that too. Walker noticed the shift, but didn't comment. He walked past her toward the cabin, expecting her to follow, and she did, without hesitation, her steps matching his pace for the first time. The day had changed something quietly and unmistakably. They had stopped being strangers surviving under the same roof. They had started becoming two people building the same space. The next morning arrived with a faint coolness drifting through the cabin window, carrying the scent of dry earth. Walker stepped outside early to split a few logs before the heat rose. The axe bit into the wood with a steady rhythm. Clean strikes, even breathing, no wasted effort. He worked the same way he handled everything, with focus that kept his thoughts from drifting too far into the past. When he returned to the cabin, he stopped in the doorway. Naira was sweeping the floor with a bundle of dried brush she had tied together with a strip of twine. The movement was slow but purposeful. Her long arms drew calm arcs across the floorboards, lifting dust into soft spirals before guiding it toward the door. She didn't notice him at first. She was too focused on doing the task correctly, as if she feared being judged for doing it at all. When she finally looked up, she froze for a moment, unsure of his reaction. "I saw the dust piling," she said. "It felt wrong to leave it." Walker set the firewood beside the stove. "It looks better that way." Her shoulders eased slightly, the tension around her eyes softening. She resumed sweeping, but now her movements held a quieter confidence. Walker prepared a small breakfast, No fuss, just bread warm near the fire and a bit of dried meat. He placed the food on the table and stepped back to give her space. Naira approached and sat in the second chair instead of standing at the edge of the room. It was the first time she chose a seat meant for someone who belonged there. They ate quietly. Walker noticed that she took slightly larger bites than the day before, a subtle sign her body was beginning to trust the certainty of food. She glanced at him occasionally, studying his manner, matching her pace to his without even realizing it. After eating, Walker gathered tools for fixing the barn roof. The last storm had shaken a few boards loose, and he didn't want rain slipping in once summer storms arrived. Naira followed him outside, carrying a small sack of nails he had set near the door. She didn't ask permission. She simply picked it up as though she had decided she was part of the work now. At the barn, Walker set a ladder against the structure and tested its stability. Naira stood close, watching him climb with careful focus. When he reached the top, he saw her studying the yard again, but this time her attention wasn't driven by fear. She was measuring the land as something she might need to maintain, not flee from. Walker hammered down the first board. Dust drifted from the roof and settled across his shoulders. Naira reached for a handful of nails before he even asked, extending her arm upward in a smooth, natural motion. When their hands met briefly as he took the nails, there was no hesitation on her part. She no longer recoiled from contact. "You've repaired roofs before," Walker said, adjusting a plank. "Many times," she replied. "My family built storage huts after winter storms. We learned quickly or food spoiled." Her tone held no sadness today, only knowledge. When Walker climbed down, he found Naira standing near the barn door, brushing dust from her skirt. Her breathing was steady, and the faint shake that had been in her hands the first day was gone. She looked stronger, more grounded. Walker handed her a cup of water. "Roof's good now." She drank slowly, then wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "This place is ordered," she said, searching for the right word. "Everything has a reason." "It keeps me sane," Walker replied, not hiding the truth. "Quiet helps." Naira considered his words. Her expression shifted in a way he hadn't seen before. Less guarded, more thoughtful. "I can see why you chose to live far from people." He met her gaze. Being alone has its limits. Her eyes lowered, studying the dust at her feet. After a moment, she spoke quietly. "Being chased for months made me think solitude was the only way to stay alive. But being here," she paused, clearing her throat. "It's the first time quiet hasn't felt dangerous." Walker didn't respond immediately. Instead, he opened the barn door to let light inside and began arranging tools back on their hooks. Naira watched him, noting how he always placed things exactly where they belonged. She stepped forward and helped, setting each item in line with the others. When they finished, the barn felt cleaner and more organized. Naira stepped outside and looked toward the cabin. She stood still for a long moment, taking in the sight of the porch, the fenced yard, the open stretch of empty land beyond it all. Then she spoke, voice low but firm. "This place, I don't feel unwanted here." Walker didn't break her gaze. "You're not." A faint expression crossed her face, something almost like relief, but steadier, more controlled. She wasn't smiling, yet her posture held a new certainty. Later, when they returned to the cabin, she chose the same chair she had sat in for breakfast. She rested her hands on the table, relaxed, present, no longer preparing to run. The room, once filled with quiet tension, now felt like a space shared by two people who were slowly learning how to exist beside each other without fear. For the first time since her arrival, Naira's presence didn't feel temporary. It felt like the start of belonging. By late afternoon, the sun had settled into a warmer angle, casting long shadows across the yard. Walker was repairing a hitch rail near the barn, while Naira sorted through a pile of worn rope, checking which strand were still strong enough to keep. The quiet between them had become a natural part of the day, comfortable, steady, and without tension. Every so often, she glanced toward the ridge, but her movements were no longer driven by panic. She was learning the land, mapping every angle the way a survivor memorizes safe ground. Walker straightened, wiping his hands on his trousers. He was about to return to the cabin for a drink of water when a faint cloud of dust rose in the distance. It drifted upward in a thin, uneven trail, the kind made by a single horse moving at a moderate pace. He paused, eyes narrowing. Naira followed his gaze and froze. Her posture stiffened, her breath stopping for a beat before she forced air back into her lungs. "Someone's coming," she said, her tone low and controlled. Walker didn't reach for his gun yet, but he adjusted his stance. "Stay close," he said, voice calm. The rider approached slowly, a tall man wearing a battered hat and a coat coated with travel dust. His horse looked tired, but the man sat upright in the saddle with a posture that showed he wasn't a wanderer passing through randomly. He reined the horse near the fence and stared toward the yard with an expression that carried more suspicion than curiosity. Walker stepped forward, positioning himself just slightly in front of Naira. She shifted behind him, not hiding completely, but letting him take the front. The rider's gaze inspected the property before landing on Walker. His voice carried the roughness of someone used to shouting orders. "I'm looking for an Apache woman passed through these parts. Tall one. Hard to miss." Walker didn't change expression. "Not sure who you mean." The man leaned his weight to one side, studying Walker's posture as though searching for lies. His eyes then darted past Walker and landed on the barn, then the porch, then finally shifted toward the edges of the yard. Naira stayed completely still behind Walker, her breathing shallow enough she barely moved. "You'd better think careful," the man said. "Word is she deserted her people. Folks like that make trouble." Walker took a single step closer to the fence, unafraid of the man's tone. "You've got no business here." The rider rested one hand on his saddle horn, brow furrowing. "If she's around, it'd be best to hand her over. Keeps everyone safer." Walker's expression tightened just enough to reveal his stance. "Move along." A long moment passed. The man studied Walker's face, weighing whether the risk was worth pushing. He glanced over the yard one last time, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he noticed something subtle in the dirt, an extra footprint, a disturbed patch of ground, a sign of another person. Naira's heart pounded, but her face remained composed. She kept her weight shifted, ready to take off running if the man dismounted. Finally, the rider clicked his tongue, turning his horse with a jerk. "If she's out here, trouble will find you too," he said over his shoulder. "Keep riding," Walker replied. The horse kicked up dust as they left, the rider glancing back once before disappearing beyond the ridge. Only when the sound faded completely did Naira release the breath she'd been holding. Her knees weakened briefly, and she steadied herself against the porch railing. Walker turned to look at her. She didn't speak, but her eyes said everything: fear, shame, gratitude, and the weight of nearly being discovered. "He recognized something," she said in a strained whisper. "Maybe my tracks earlier." "Doesn't matter," Walker answered. "He's gone." Naira shook her head slightly, still processing the moment. Men like him don't stop when they want something. Walker stepped closer, his tone firm but quiet. "You're safe here." She met his gaze, searching for any sign of doubt. There was none. His stance alone showed he meant every word. The tension in her jaw eased a fraction, though the fear hadn't fully left her eyes. Inside the cabin, she sat on the edge of the bench, hands gripping the wood until her knuckles tightened. Walker poured water and handed her the cup. Her fingers were unsteady but controlled. "He shouldn't have come this close," she said, voice low. "He won't be back today." Walker folded his arms. "And you're not alone." The words hung in the quiet room with more weight than the ones they'd exchanged before. Naira looked down at the cup, her breath beginning to steady. Walker stepped back outside, checking the horizon again. The land was calm now. No dust trails, no riders, only the evening wind stirring the grass. When he turned around, he saw Naira standing in the doorway, not hiding, not crouching, but upright and grounded. She wasn't thanking him aloud. She didn't need to. The fear that had lived in her since the day she was exiled had shifted. For the first time in months, she had someone willing to stand in front of her without hesitation. And for Walker, the realization came quietly. He didn't mind protecting her. In fact, something about it felt right. Evenings settled slowly over the land, turning the ridge into a long dark line against the fading sky. After the rider vanished hours earlier, the air around the ranch had grown tense in a quiet, lingering way. Neither Walker nor Naira spoke much for the rest of the day. The fear she tried to bury kept returning to her face in brief flashes, then disappearing when she forced her posture straight again. Walker stepped onto the porch after finishing the last of his chores. He lowered himself onto the bench with a slow exhale, resting his elbows on his knees. He could still feel the tension of the encounter in his shoulders, like a coiled wire that hadn't fully loosened. His mind replayed the rider's words, the threat implied behind them, and the sharp, watchful way Naira had looked at the horizon afterward. The cabin door opened gently. Naira stepped out, her movements quiet but deliberate. She hesitated before sitting beside him, leaving a small space between them, but not as much as she would have on her first night. The fading light caught the lines of her face, tired, alert, and holding something heavy she hadn't yet spoken. Walker tilted his head slightly, but didn't interrupt her silence. She stared ahead at the empty stretch of land, her breathing deep and uneven. It was the first sign that she was wrestling with something she could no longer ignore. "I thought leaving would solve everything," she said finally, her voice low. "But trouble follows even when you try to outrun it." Walker didn't respond immediately. He watched her hands, resting on her thighs, but trembling faintly under the surface. Her control was slipping, not from panic, but from carrying too much alone. "That man today," she continued, eyes fixed on the horizon, "he's not someone from my old life. But men like him keep appearing. They sense weakness. They sense when a woman has no one to stand with her." Her jaw tightened. "I lived months expecting danger every time I closed my eyes." Walker's brow lowered, but he kept his voice steady. "You've survived everything they threw at you." Naira shook her head once, not in denial, but in frustration. "Survival isn't the same as living. Every step I took these past months, I expected someone to drag me back. I never knew if the next day meant freedom or punishment." Her words cut into the quiet air, like a truth spoken for the first time. Walker leaned back slightly, letting his shoulder touch the wooden wall behind him. "You're not wandering anymore." Naira's gaze shifted to him, sharp but uncertain. "I didn't want my past to reach your door. You didn't ask for this." Walker held her eyes. "You didn't choose any of what happened. And I'm not pushing you out because someone came looking." For a moment, she didn't breathe. His words landed with more weight than either expected. She looked down at her hands again, as if seeing every mile she had walked reflected in the dirt under her nails. "When they cast me out, I left everything behind. People I cared for turned away. Home stopped being home. I told myself I didn't need anyone after that." Her voice grew quieter. "But standing behind you today, I realized I've been afraid of being seen, not because I'm tall or strong, but because I didn't believe anyone would choose to stand with me." Walker absorbed every word, his expression steady. "I stood because I wanted to." Something subtle cracked inside her, an emotional shift she tried to hide by looking back toward the darkening horizon, but the change still showed in the loosened tension around her mouth and the slight drop of her shoulders. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do now," she admitted. "I've never stopped long enough to think beyond the next safe place." Walker rested his hands on his thighs. The evening wind moved across the yard, pushing strands of her long black hair across her face. She didn't brush them away. She simply watched the land, waiting for him to judge her fears or dismiss them. He didn't. "You don't have to figure everything out today," he said. "You're here. That's enough for now." Naira closed her eyes briefly, a small act that revealed trust. When she opened them again, they held a steadiness that hadn't been there before. "I don't want to keep running," she said quietly. "You don't have to," Walker replied. She studied him again, searching for hesitation or doubt. She found none. Walker's face remained grounded, calm, and resolute. It gave her something she hadn't felt since the day she was cast out: choice. The sky deepened into dusk. Coyotes began calling from the distant hills, their cries echoing faintly. Naira didn't flinch this time. Her body stayed settled, her mind finally quiet enough to let the moment exist without fear rushing back in. Walker stood and opened the cabin door. He waited, not demanding, not urging, just giving her space to return inside when she was ready. After a long, steady breath, Naira rose from the bench. She moved beside him and stepped over the threshold with a certainty that hadn't been present the night she arrived. Her steps were still heavy from the day's fear, but now they carried intention rather than survival alone. Inside, she sat on the chair she had begun claiming as her place. Walker set a lantern on the table, the warm light spreading softly across the room. Naira rested her palms on the wood, grounding herself. She looked up and spoke with clear conviction. I want to stop worrying about where I'll wake tomorrow. I want to stay here if you'll let me. Walker didn't hesitate. You can stay as long as you want. Her breathing eased in a slow, controlled release, like someone finally setting down a burden she had carried too far, too long. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, she wasn't bracing for the next attack, the next chase, the next betrayal. She was making a decision for herself. And Walker, who had thought solitude was the only path left for him, realized he didn't mind sharing his space with someone who understood what it meant to lose everything and still keep standing. Night closed in fully around the cabin. For both of them, it felt less threatening than it ever had. The fear that once dominated her steps no longer dictated her future. Naira had finally chosen a place to stop running, and she chose Walker's home. The next morning arrived with a clear sky, the kind that made the distant ridge look sharper and the dry earth brighter than usual. Walker stepped outside early, expecting to start the day like every other, splitting wood, checking the water trough, feeding the horse. But when he reached the corral, he stopped. Naira was already there. She carried a wooden bucket in each hand, moving with controlled strength as she poured fresh water into the trough. Her hair was tied back with a strip of cloth she must have found in the cabin, and though her height still made her stand out against the landscape, she didn't look out of place anymore. Instead, she blended into the morning routine as though she had stepped into a life she had once lived. Walker watched her for a moment without calling attention to himself. What struck him wasn't her physical power. He had already seen that. It was the way she worked with quiet intention, evaluating each task before doing it. For the first time, she looked like someone making a home rather than a temporary shelter. She glanced over her shoulder and saw him standing there. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face, as if she wasn't sure whether she'd overstepped. But Walker only nodded in greeting. "You're up early," he said. "I slept better last night," she answered. "My mind didn't run as much." Walker understood the significance of that simple statement. Fear had ruled her thoughts for months. The fact that she had rested was a sign that her guard had eased in ways she couldn't fully explain yet. Naira lifted the last bucket and emptied it, her movements efficient. When she set it down, she wiped her hands on her skirt and stepped toward the barn. Walker followed without rushing her, letting her set the tempo of the morning. Inside the barn, the smell of hay and old wood surrounded them. Light leaked through small cracks in the walls, creating thin lines across the floor. Naira reached into the grain sack and filled a scoop, carefully measuring the amount before pouring it into the horse's trough. The animal nudged her arm gently, and she let her palm rest on its neck for a brief moment. No hesitation, no flinch. Walker noticed the shift immediately. The day she arrived, she couldn't stand close to the horse without stiffening. Now, she handled it calmly, like someone reclaiming a lost skill. "You're good with animals," Walker said. "I grew up taking care of my uncle's horses," she replied. "They listen better than most people." Walker let out a short breath that almost passed as a quiet laugh. It wasn't humor exactly, more an acknowledgement that her world before exile might have held pieces of normal life, not just fear and restraint. Naira finished her task and stepped back, brushing dust off her hands. She looked around the barn with a careful eye, noting every weak board, every loose hook, every section that needed tightening. "You keep everything in order," she said. "It helps me think," Walker replied. She nodded. "Then let me help keep it that way." There was no uncertainty in her voice now. She wasn't asking permission, She was telling him she wanted to be part of the work. Walker didn't argue. They moved through the morning tasks as a pair. Naira cleared old straw from the stall, while Walker repaired a loose hinge. Whenever one stepped aside, the other moved in naturally, as though they had practiced this rhythm for weeks rather than days. They didn't talk much. Words seemed unnecessary in the flow of their routine. Around midday, Walker carried a small crate of tools to the porch. Naira followed with a bundle of dried brush she had gathered from the yard. She knelt beside the steps and began sorting through the pieces, choosing which ones would be useful for future cleaning. "Where did you learn to adapt so quickly?" Walker asked as he set down the crate. "Living on the move forces you to adjust," she said. "I learned to work with whatever land I found, even if it wasn't mine." Walker watched her organize the brush into tidy piles. Her movements were methodical, almost meditative. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't waiting for danger. She was simply existing in the space, contributing without waiting to be told. Inside the cabin, the afternoon light filled the room. Walker repaired a drawer that had begun sticking from humidity, and Naira sat at the table, sharpening the edge of a kitchen knife with slow, even strokes. She wasn't performing busy work. She was maintaining the tools, as though preparing a home she intended to protect. When she finished, she stood and placed the knife back in its slot. Walker looked up, noticing how naturally she moved now. She no longer avoided touching his things. She no longer watched his every shift with guarded eyes. She approached the window and looked out with a long breath. "It's quieter here than any place I've been." "Quiet can be good," Walker said. "It can," she replied, "but only when someone else shares it." The statement hung in the air. Walker didn't respond right away. He felt something shift internally. Nothing dramatic, just a slow recognition that her presence had started filling the empty parts of his life he had accepted as permanent. Naira turned from the window. "I told myself yesterday that staying might be dangerous for you, but running again would break me. I'm tired of losing every place I reach." Walker stepped closer, not invading her space, but standing near enough that she knew he wasn't retreating from her honesty. "You're not losing this place." She studied him, searching for any doubt, any sign of hesitation. Instead, she saw calm acceptance, something she wasn't sure she deserved but needed desperately. Her posture relaxed a bit. "I didn't expect to feel welcome." Walker shook his head. "You're not a burden." The weight of those words hit her harder than the threat earlier in the week. She lowered herself to sit on the edge of the bed, elbows resting on her knees, her long frame folding slightly as the tension finally eased from her back. "I forgot what it felt like to be part of something," she admitted. Walker didn't move closer, but his presence was steady and grounding. "You're part of this now." Hours later, as the sun fell behind the ridge, they stood outside again. The wind was softer than the night before, brushing the grass in slow waves. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The land felt less empty than it ever had. Two sets of footprints marked the ground near the porch. Two people moved through the evening light as though they belonged there side by side. And for the first time since her exile, Naira didn't think about leaving. She thought about tomorrow. The next morning broke with a soft glow across the ridge, lighting the dry land in a way that made every line of the valley clear. The warmth of the early sun filtered through the cabin window, casting a long stripe across the wooden floor. Walker woke before Naira, as he usually did, but he didn't rise immediately. He sat on the edge of his bed and listened to the steady rhythm of her breathing from across the room. There was no abrupt movement, no restless shifting the way she had done the first nights. Her sleep was deep, calm, anchored. He allowed himself a quiet moment to take in what that meant. She no longer expected danger at dawn. When she stirred, her eyes opened gradually, not with alarm, but with the kind of stillness that comes from feeling safe. She pushed herself upright, brushing her hair away from her face, and met his gaze with a grounded expression. "Morning," she said. "Morning," Walker replied. She studied the cabin briefly, the tools neatly arranged, the blankets folded near the stove, the chair she now used as if it had always been meant for her. Her attention lingered on these details, absorbing the reality that this wasn't a temporary refuge anymore. Walker stepped outside to start feeding the horse. Nayara joined him a moment later, carrying the grain scoop without being asked. They worked in sync, falling into the same quiet rhythm they had begun forming days earlier. The horse nudged Nayara's shoulder gently as she poured the feed, earning a subtle lift of her lips. Not quite a smile, but something warm enough to hint at it. After they finished the chores, Walker checked the fence line, while Nayara inspected the water barrels. The land stretched open in every direction, undisturbed except for the soft movement of wind across the grass. There were no riders in sight, no dust trails, no tension pressing at the edges of the yard. For the first time since her arrival, Nayara wasn't scanning the ridge for trouble. She was simply existing in the moment. Walker returned to the porch and leaned against the railing. Nayara joined him, standing tall beside him, her shoulders no longer tight with fear. The quiet between them was steady, comfortable, and filled with unspoken understanding. She took a slow breath. "I've been thinking about yesterday, about everything." Walker didn't interrupt. Her voice held a weight that came from making a decision she had resisted for too long. "I know I can't go back to the life I had," she said. "What little was there is gone. My place, my role, my family, all of it. Ended the day they turned their backs on me." She rested her hand lightly on the railing. "But I found something here I didn't expect. I'm not running anymore." Walker shifted slightly, watching her profile. Her expression was steady, resolved. "You don't have to leave," he said. She looked at him, her eyes clear and certain. "I don't want to." Her words landed with quiet finality. It wasn't desperation, it was choice. She stepped down into the yard, her boots kicking up a little dust as she moved toward the barn. Walker followed. They began clearing out the corner where old equipment had piled up over the years. Nayara lifted heavy crates with ease while Walker organized the smaller tools. The barn slowly transformed from cluttered storage to an orderly workspace. As they worked, Nayara paused to wipe sweat from her forehead. She glanced at Walker, her tone shifting to something more personal. "When I arrived, I thought you would send me away after one night," she said. "I didn't expect kindness. I didn't expect patience. I didn't expect trust. I didn't expect anyone to share this place," Walker admitted. "But you fit here." Nayara's chest rose and fell with a controlled breath. "You didn't treat me like a threat. You didn't ask me to prove myself. You didn't look away from my size or my past." Her voice softened. "No one else has done that." Walker held her gaze. "You earned your place here by surviving everything they try to break you with." She didn't look away. "And you earned mine by standing in front of me when danger came." Their eyes held for a moment that stretched longer than usual. It wasn't romantic in a dramatic way. It was deeper, grounded in respect, in shared pain, in trust built through silence and routine. They returned to work, but something had shifted. Each task felt different now. Not just survival, not obligation, something close to partnership. By afternoon, the barn looked renewed. Walker stepped back, hands on his hips, examining the space. Nayara wiped her palms on her skirt and followed his gaze. "It looks better," she said. "It's a good start," Walker replied. Nayara leaned against the barn doorway, watching him quietly. "I want to help rebuild the whole place. Not just small repairs. I want to make this land stronger." Walker nodded. "Then we'll do it together." The simplicity of the statement grounded her. She lowered her head for a moment, taking in the weight of that promise. When evening came, they carried supper to the porch. The air cooled, and the last streaks of sunlight stretched across the yard. They sat side by side, eating in silence that wasn't empty. Every small sound, the rustle of grass, the distant call of a nightboard, the creak of the porch boards, felt like a piece of the life forming between them. After they finished, Nayara rested her elbows on her knees, studying the horizon. "Walker," she said, her voice steady but gentle. "I don't want to live half a life anymore. I don't want to wander with no purpose." She turned to him fully. "I want to be here, with you, if you'll have me." Walker didn't hesitate, not even for a breath. "You're already part of this place, and part of my life." A long breath escaped Nayara's chest, the deepest, calmest one he had ever seen her take. Her entire posture loosened, like someone stepping fully into a life she never believed she could claim. She shifted closer, not touching him, but leaving no distance in intent, and leaned her shoulder lightly against his. It was a simple gesture, but it carried everything: trust, acceptance, commitment. Walker remained still, letting her choose the closeness. Then he let his shoulder meet hers in return. The sun dipped below the ridge for the final time that day. Darkness settled gently over the land. Two silhouettes sat on the porch, not as strangers, not as temporary companions, but as two people who had chosen each other without fear. The ranch was no longer Walker's alone. It was theirs, and both of them, in their own quiet way, knew they had finally come home.